examination of the prior entity. Now one can surely imagine an opponent responding to the argument of the previous chapter by granting that agency and its correlative phenomena might be empty, yet still denying that awareness itself, the subjectivity that grounds perception, could be empty. For, one might argue, the emptiness of all phenomena still requires that there be a subject for whom they are phenomena. Nagarjuna articulates this response in the opening verses of this chapter. 1. Since sight and hearing, etc., and feeling, etc., exist, he who has and uses them must exist prior to those, some say. 2. If there were no existent thing, how could seeing, etc., arise? It follows from this that prior to this, there is an existent thing. That is, without a subject of experience, there can be no experience and no experienced objects. This argument has familiar instances in Descartes and Kant. But Nagarjuna, siding with Hume on this issue, begins by asking how this entity could be an object of knowledge. 3. How is an entity existing prior to seeing, hearing, etc., and the felt, etc., itself known? So first, Nagarjuna points out, we have no direct evidence for the existence of such an entity because evidence of it would require that it could be an object, but is supposed by its proponent to be purely subjective. Moreover, Nagarjuna points out, it is supposed to be independent of and ontologically prior to perception and the perceived. So, 4. If it can abide without the seen, etc., then, without a doubt, they can abide without it. That is, independence is a two-way street. If the self is independent of its perceiving and perception, then its perceiving and perception are independent of it. Now there is one reading of this claim on which it is straightforwardly and foolishly fallacious. Nagarjuna is not arguing that all relations are symmetric. It does not follow from the fact that this book is on your table that your table is on the book, and Nagarjuna is not foolish enough to think that it does. The point is, rather, once again, the Humean one that whatever is indeed logically independent is separable. The opponent wants to argue that the self is logically independent of its perceptions and their contents. But if so, then they are separable, and we can imagine not only a non-perceiving subject, but also unperceived perceptions. Just as we can imagine a clear table and a book not on a table. But, Nagarjuna suggests, the idea of unperceived perceptions is both absurd on its face and contradictory to the opponent's theoretical framework. 5. Someone is disclosed by something. Something is disclosed by someone. Without something, how can someone exist? Without someone, how can something exist? Nagarjuna here emphasizes the correlativity and interdependence of subject and object. Subjectivity only emerges when there is an object of awareness. Pure subjectivity is a contradiction in ejecto. Moreover, the idea of an object if no subject is contradictory. The very concept of being an object is that of being the object of a subject. The affinities to Kant and Schopenhauer here are quite strong, but should not be pushed too far. Nagarjuna would clearly have no truck with the substantialist flavor of their analysis of the subject and object. 6. While prior to all of seeing, etc., that prior entity doesn't exist, through seeing, etc., by another one, that other one becomes disclosed. An opponent might at this point argue that although there is no continuous prior entity that endures through time and stands behind all perception, we must posit an entity as the basis of each individual perceptual episode. The self on this model would be a succession of momentary but inherently existent subjects of moments of experience. But, Nagarjuna argues in the next verse, the same argument against positing a single prior entity can be mobilized against each punctal prior entity. 7. If prior to all of seeing, etc., no prior entity exists, how could an entity prior to each seeing exist? That is, given that there is no need to identify an independent self as the basis of all seeing, there is no need to establish one as a basis for each one independently. The same arguments for the relativity and relational character of perception apply, mutatis mutandis, for each perceptual episode. Moreover, even if we did posit such entities, they would get us nowhere toward positing the self that the reifier of self really cares about, a continuous self with which we can really identity and whose fate we can care about. 8. If the seer itself is the hearer itself and the feeler itself at different times. Prior to each of these, he would have to arise. But this makes no sense. Moreover, since this proposal is for a distinct prior entity for each perceptual episode, we would need distinct subjects for example, hearing and seeing. But as we can do these things at the same time, it would follow that there are multiple simultaneous selves. The unity of experience. That is the putative explanandum and motivation for positing this entity in the first place, emphasized in the first 2 lines, would dissolve. Nagarjuna emphasizes this conclusion at 9:9. 9. If the seer itself is distinct. The hearer is distinct and the feeler is distinct. Then when there is a seer, there would also be a hearer, and there would have to be many selves. 10. Seeing and hearing, etc., and feeling, etc. And that from which these are arisen, there is no existent there. However, one should not be tempted to try to ground perception, the perceived object, and the perceiver in some more fundamental ontological ground, some intrinsically identical basis for their existence. For the need to develop a substantial foundation for these phenomena should vanish once one sees that not only do they have no ultimate ontic status, but that they need none. They, like all phenomena, emerge relationally independently. 11. Seeing and hearing, etc., and feeling, etc. If that to which they belong does not exist, they themselves do not exist. Not only has this analysis refuted the inherent existence of the self as a basis for experience, but in virtue of so doing, it has refuted the inherent existence of perception and the perceptual faculties. 12. For whomever prior to, simultaneous with, or after seeing, etc., there is nothing. For such a one, assertions like, it exists, or, it does not exist, such conceptions will cease. Nagarjuna here generalizes the point and offers a diagnosis of the confusion he has worked to resolve. Just as we want to say that the self as pure subject does not exist, nor do perception or perceptual objects exist as entities, yet want to affirm the conventional reality of perception, perceivers, and perceiveds, in general, we want to deny the inherent existence of phenomena and affirm their conventional reality. Just as we want to say that the self neither exists inherently nor that it is non-existent inherently, we want to refrain from attributing inherent existence or inherent non-existence to all entities. The apparent paradox involved in saying that things both exist and do not exist in one breath and saying that they neither exist nor do not exist in another, indeed of refusing in another sense to permit even these predications in another mood, arises, Nagarjuna points out, from the conceptual imputation of inherently existent bases for these predications, which then have to be thought of as having contradictory properties. Absent the bases, we can see these assertions merely as useful analytical tools in various dialectical contexts to help us to see the ultimately empty and conventionally real nature of phenomena. And Nagarjuna concludes this chapter by asserting that once one ceases hypostasizing the subjective self, that entity that might seem to be, as Descartes notes, the most obviously existent and most easily known entity of all, the temptation to hypostasize other entities dissolves.